Hey everybody, what's going on? It's your boy Rich. Real Talk with Rich is back with a special edition on tonight. We are going to be talking about an amazing book, Weird Fantasy 18. And as you can see, I have two gentlemen with me today. Y'all know the super duper producer Derek. He's joining us. And of course, we always have from time to time the legendary historian himself, Ken Quattro, who is the author of the amazing book. Put it on screen, Derek, so we can plug it real good. Invisible Men, Trailblazing, Black Artists of Comics books. An amazing book. We've had several discussions. You can go to our YouTube page and check out some of the back discussions. I promise you, you will be blessed if you just check out the information that this incredible human being put down for us to matriculate, discuss, argue over, that kind of thing. So that being said, guys, how y'all doing?
I'm fine, man. I'm impressed by myself just hearing that.
That's what's up. Want to salute everybody that's in the chat with us. Thank you guys for joining us. We're going to have a dope show tonight, guys. And again, we're here to have a discussion about. We're a comic book group, right? But we very seldom just take the time to just focus on one book. If we're going to focus on one book, that book has to be very, very important. And that book tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is Weird Fantasy number 18 by EC Comics. This particular book is a piece of history that speaks to even today, I would say. And so tonight we're going to have a dope discussion about this. And before we get into this, we just first want to tell you guys there's a little backstory about who EC Comics is. EC Comics is a company that published all kinds of different books, whether we talk about science fiction, horror, but you may know them modern wise from putting out Mad Magazine. Now, when I was a kid, Mad Magazine was the book to have. Now, crack would give them a run for their money sometimes, but no, if you do not have Alfred E. Newman in your collection, you cannot say you are a comic book enthusiast. I'm just saying. You know, my man was all over the place. I have a few Mad magazines in my collection to this day. And but this is the company that put that book out. But EC Comics, or Entertainment Comics, has been around a long time. They put out a lot of books in the 40s and 50s. Silver Age company, and their range is pretty strong. Tales from the Crypt, ladies and gentlemen. If you enjoyed reading those books, when I was a kid, and I'm going to shut up and I'm going to let you talk about this a little bit, Derek and Ken. When I was a kid, my uncle used to collect creepy monster magazines and Tales from the Crypt. And so I would go to my grandmother's house, not to eat up the food at the house, but to rob his stash of Tales from the Crypt and Monster magazine. So I grew up with this stuff, and it's just been a fun thing. It's been a part of my fandom since I was a child. So, Derek and Ken, what is your relationship, or do you have any relationship with this company other than what we're going to talk about tonight?
I'm going to yield all my time to Mr. Quattro.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I've been involved in comics for, like I said, over 60 years. And I came along at the very beginning of what's considered modern day comic fandom. And even at that time, you know, my goal was to collect as many of these EC comics as I could. They were probably the best produced, the best drawn, the best written comic books of their time, which was, just like you said, Rich, in the 1950s and 40s. They had the best artists. They had guys like Frank Frazetta and Jack Davis and Wally Wood and all these other amazing artists working for them. And the main writer and editor of the company was a guy named Al Fieldstein. And Al Fieldstein later became the editor of Mad Magazine, and he essentially became the face of the company for years and years and years. And he was an amazing guy. I got to know him in his later years. We actually became pretty good friends. He would just call me up out of the blue once in a while, and we would just talk. But he was an amazing man, very intelligent, and he has a tie to Black history in the sense of, like, when he was just starting out as a young artist. He was working in the Jerry Iger studio, and the person sitting next to him was Matt Baker. And he would chat with Matt Baker, and a lot of the information, the background information that I learned about Matt Baker came from Al Fieldstein. So he was historically a very important person and very, a great resource for a lot of things I've learned, but he wasn't always the most reliable resource, which we can talk about later on. Anyways.
That's it. So go ahead, Derek.
And then and we were talking backstage that EC was also known for the preachies that they would make.
Exactly.
Well, is that something you want to talk about now, or wait till a little bit later?
I think we should talk about that now, because that's the thing. In our space, we often talk about, politics and comics and social justice issues or whatever. And some people don't like that stuff in their comic books. But it's been in the comics for decades.
Since they began.
It's one of those companies that just happened to do it, and they had multiple issues, whether we're talking about anti-Semitism, racism, all kind of different things. They were not afraid to kind of like show a picture of American life or life in the West, and it was there to entertain you, but it was also there to make you think. And I think one of the good things I love about stories or whatever, I love stories that make you feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing. It's what good is to read something, right? And you can get something out of it, but what good is it if it doesn't make you think about something? I understand the thoughts that, I really don't want to be preached to or whatever, but I can appreciate someone that wants to shed light on issues of our day, as long as they're doing it in an entertaining way. But yeah, I just think that, they call it the preachies or whatever. They understand, which I think is kind of funny when I think about it. Because, people bought these books back in the day for just entertainment. They were bought it for 10 cents, and you read the story and you wrapped it up, put it in your bag, or you threw it away or whatever, right? It was never something that I would say we would like mistake this for literature and Shakespeare. But, pulp fiction, that kind of stuff, part of its I would say appeal is that you're telling stories, and they have certain things in the stories, whether you want to call it a moral or a purpose or whatever,
right,
that you should get out of it. So, let's talk about, the preachies of back in the day, Ken. I mean, what is your thoughts about it?
I'm glad you brought all that up. It should be understood that the men publishing comic books, most of them came from poor backgrounds. Many of them were Jewish, and they came from poor immigrant backgrounds and stuff. And they're mostly very liberal, socially conscious people, almost, across the board, almost every single one of them. It was economics that prohibited them from displaying their liberalism, though, in their comics. For instance, back in the 1940s, realistically, they couldn't depict a heroic black figure on the cover of a comic book, because in the South, they wouldn't put those comics on the newsstand. And there was instances, probably one of the best known is the Crown comics, where it had Matt Baker's voodoo character in it. Inside the comic book, Matt Baker had drawn a black man as a heroic figure. Yet on the cover of the comic book, the character was depicted as white, because he couldn't be put on, otherwise it never would have been sold in the South. So you have to understand that most of these people who created comic books were very liberal-minded themselves, but they feared the repercussions they would have, economic repercussions, if they tried doing that openly. And that's what made EC unique. And that's why, Al Fieldstein and Bill Gaines, the publisher, deserve all the credit in the world for what they did, because they dared to publish these controversial subjects in comic books. It wasn't obviously not every story, because most of their stories were just, like you said, for entertainment value. But they dared to publish these stories about anti-Semitism and all different subjects. But, and that's why this story here, Judgment Day, is probably the most important comic book story of all time. Because
Wow.
it transcended the normal, well, I don't know what the words I'm looking for, but the normal comic book boundaries that were set. And, anybody reading it, anybody of an open mind reading it, realized that. That's why they got so many fan letters from, like, Ray Bradbury, the famous science fiction writer who wrote a fan letter about it. And ironically, when the story first appeared in 1953 in Weird Fantasy number 18, in 1953, they got almost universal acclaim for the story. It wasn't like there was protest or anything like that, which is kind of ironic when you look at a lot of comics nowadays and people are always, get up in arms about a certain subject being discussed in a comic or whatever. I mean, this was appreciated for what it was. And that's something that should be understood, was that EC had a more intelligent, older readership than most comic books did. Most comic books were aimed at 10-year-olds. EC had, like, it was generally considered they had high school and above readership. And it was reflected in their stories. And like I said, this story here, Judgment Day, with that, which I'll let you guys discuss more of the story itself. But basically, the shock ending was, it was just sort of like somebody throwing cold water on somebody. It was just a shock to the reader at the time. And but see, that was Al Feldstein's thing. He was a big fan of O. Henry, and the twist ending. And this was right down his alley, this sort of story. But the ending here was just such a classic, and deservedly so. Like I said, it's probably the single greatest and most impactful comic book story of all time, and that's really saying something when you look at the entire history of comics.
So I just wanted to pause on that one, because I don't think I've ever heard anybody refer to that story in that way, and that's a weighty statement to come from a historian. Can you?
Well, see, and that's how I look at things, Derek, as, for historical value. 100 years from now, when they look back at comics history, nobody's going to remember, oh, hey, do you remember that issue where Wolverine fought the Hulk? They're going to remember, hey, do you remember that story in Weird Fantasy number 18? Where in the very last panel, it was the twist ending. And again, you got to remember the time period this came out in the early 1950s. It was, like I say, a shock to the reader. And it was sort of like a wake-up call, to the reader. And for that reason, historically, it's an incredibly important book. Just like, there's a lot of other comics I've written about, like the Crown Comics 3 with the voodoo story and stuff like that, or voodoo story. They transcend the comic book medium itself, and they become historical touchstones for American culture. And that's what I believe this story is.
Wow, so transcendent, the most important comic book story of all time. So
Yeah.
That's what we're going to jump into. All right.
Yes, sir.
So if anybody in the chat who has not heard of this story yet, this is your first time, we'll jump into that and show you why. But before we do that, in doing some research, just background, did come across this book by Keanu Whitted called EC Comics: Race, Shock, and Social Protest. So actually, I think Rich ordered the book tonight. So yeah, so it seems to be a very well-researched book that really tries to document the role that EC played in the preachies and really speaking out on race, on religion, and social justice issues, way ahead of its time.
Right.
And then also another book by Keanu Whitted is Desegregating Comics, which I know a lot of people in the community have.
Man, that's a great book. That's a great book.
Yep. Okay, so with that said, there we go. Ditto. So with that said, we're going to jump right in. The first point I wanted to make, though, is that so this story, Judgment Day, was originally, as Ken mentioned, was originally published in 1953 in Weird
Yes.
Fantasy number 18, and then a second time in 1956, Incredible Science Fiction number 33. It was not the original story that was going to be put in into this book, according to Al Fieldstein, but it was added as the last story as a replacement due to back and forth between EC and the Comics Code Authority. So we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. So I guess the key thing is, even though in our community we talk so much about Weird Fantasy number 18, but this is another important one. And by the way, it is EC's very last comic, and then Judgment Day, as I understand, was the very last story in their very last comic.
Yes.
Hi, NBA Live Girl. Okay, so let's step right into the story. So this is the story of Judgment Day. Rich, anything you want to say, or?
Well, it's a short story. I'm gonna let you narrate the story,
all right.
but I will just simply say about it is that it's, when you go into it, it's one of those things where it's like getting onto a ride, if I can say it like that. And you're like, oh, this is cool. I'm on the ride. You know what I'm saying? They started the machine up, and so now I'm on the ride, and okay, we're doing a little twists and turns, not too bad or whatever. And then they take us up a cliff.
Mm-hmm.
and drop us. But you're not ready for it. You're just kind of like, oh, this is nice. The water's fine. Yeah. And then all of a sudden they get real at the very end. That's why I love this story, because I got to say this before you get into it, Derek. As a comic book head, every comic book head loves a shocking finish to a story. And comic book retailers love that too, because they know that if they do it right, you're going to run to get to the next issue. So this particular story here, it has that same effect. So that's one of the reasons why I enjoy it. So, yeah.
Yeah. But see, that was kind of Al Feldstein's writing style. Like I said, the twist endings. But a lot of time, the twist endings he came up with were almost like jokes and stuff like that. There's a lot of his stories which ended in jokes. This was a dead serious subject, and that's part of the reason why it was so impactful at the time. And the story itself is allegorical, like you mentioned, but it's you don't have to write a long story to get a point across. And I think that's part of the brilliance of this. I mean, some of the best comic stories have been very short.
Yep.
And, it doesn't have to run on for issues. It doesn't have to be told over 20 issues. A good writer can tell a story in a short period of time, a Hemingway or a O. Henry or, all these other writers. And it's that's what Feldstein did here. And again, this story can be read, like you said, in just a few minutes. But like you said, Rich, you think you're just reading, a basic science fiction story, and all of a sudden it's like somebody came up and slapped you across the face at the end. You're like, whoa, okay.
Yeah.
Especially for the time, because other people weren't writing stories like that. And that's the other thing you have to understand. In 1953, most stories were pretty cookie cutter, very bland, um, very formulaic. They just follow the same formula over and over again. But EC didn't do that, and they're always changing it up. And again, it's part of the greatness of this story. And I'm going to shut up and let you guys talk.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Derek. Tell us about this story, man.
All right, I'm going to do my best. So first of all, before I start, everybody just take a deep breath, close your eyes for a minute, and as best as you can, pretend you're actually in 1953 and you're a comic book fan and you're reading this book. Don't be thinking about this as 2024 you. Think about this as somebody in 1953. Okay, story kicks off with a person landing on a planet inhabited by robots. This person's name is Tarleton and is a representative of the Galactic Republic. And he's there to inspect the planet and to see if this society is ready to join the Galactic Republic. All right. So as he's doing that, he's guided around by these robots. You can see the robots, they're all orange. And they take him to their factory where they're made. They explain how they're made, how they're tested, how they're programmed. And he's like, "Oh, okay, this is pretty good. They're far advanced. They're at a point where they can actually, create more robots, and they have a whole robot society." Um, but then he has some questions for them. Specifically, um, he has questions about. He knows there are blue robots on the planet too, but blue robots, he's not seeing them. And they say, well, the blue robots, they're made in the factory on the other side. So he has to be taken over there. They resist a little bit, but they eventually take him over there. So now he's touring the blue robot factory and he's talking with one of the blue robots there. And as they're going through how these robots are created, he's noticing same things are going inside these robots. Everything is the same. The only difference is that the sheathing or the outside, covering for the robots blue instead of orange. And then there's this really important exchange between first Tarleton and the blue robot, where the blue robot is talking about what it means to be a blue robot as opposed to an orange robot. You can see on the page here, it limits us to menial jobs, sends us to the rear of mobile buses, places us in different recharging stations, forces us to live in a special section of the city, right? So Tarleton's now getting a feeling that, okay, this is a second-class citizen. As the story goes on, he continues to ask more questions, and then he also finds out that not only are they treated differently because of their external sheathing, but he also finds out that they don't get the benefit of the same educator that is used on the orange robots. Specifically, you can see in the words here, the blue educator, it hasn't the advantages of the orange educator. Um, so Tarleton is now making some connections in his mind. He's thinking, wow, so the educators, like the parents and the relatives and environment and the school, all rolled into one. So after all of this, he comes to a conclusion. His conclusion is that they're not ready to join society, specifically because they are practicing segregation. So he says, hey, we'll have to try again later. You're not ready yet. Keep on working at it. There's another exchange we can cover in a little bit. So anyway, he hops back in the spaceship, and then in the very last panel, as he goes in the spaceship is taking off. So at that point, on the very last panel, you see he's removed his helmet, and he is a black man. So clearly, the Earth that he is from and that he represents is an Earth that's way in the future, because 1953 is very much like that robot planet that he had just visited. So once again, a 1953 reader has been shaken because this story has pointed a finger right back at the society that they live in. And there's one other key statement in here, if I can find it, that really resonated with me, which was, let's see. When he's debating with this orange robot, and Sorry, we can't see this too well. Let me go to my other page. The orange robot says, "You're lecturing me as though all of this were my fault, Tarleton. This existed long before I was made. What can I do about it? I'm only one robot." So once again, he's talking to one of the orange robots that benefit from this, or not benefit, but they get the upper hand from this society. So once again, a lot of words being said here and a lot of things to shake a reader. So let me take a step back. See, Rich, Mr. Quattro, your thoughts?
Well, I'll let Rich go first if you want.
You go ahead, Mr. Quattro. Go ahead.
Okay, well, again, you set this up brilliantly, Derek, by telling people try to, take themselves back to 1953. And just to provide some historical context, people have to understand it was in 1954 that the Supreme Court ruled on Brown versus the Board of Education. And that was the one that desegregated schools. In 1953, when this story came out, the educational system in parts of the United States were legally segregated. So when that character talks about the education, that's a direct reference to something that was ongoing at the time in the United States. I'm glad you pointed out the panel too, where the guy says, I'm only one man, what can I do? And that kind of just speaks to the whole mindset of a lot of well-meaning people. And I'm going to kind of go delicately here because I don't want to insult anybody, but there's a lot of well-meaning people who will talk the talk, but don't necessarily walk the walk. And they'll pontificate on how things should be and stuff like that. But what did they actually do to make changes? And in 1953 here, there weren't a whole lot of white people actively involved in a lot of this social change. A lot of the social change came out of the Black community itself, which was only a couple of years later where Rosa Parks, started with that whole the bus.
Montgomery bus boycott. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, my mind slipped there. And Martin Luther King was just a preacher at this time. He still was a few years into the future. So even all these well-meaning white people, even guys like Al Fieldstein and Bill Gaines, a lot of it was talk. And it's kind of ironic that he even put that panel in there because that, like you said, it points the figure back at him and a lot of other white people at that time. And, you got to understand, like I said, the comic book industry was basically created by and controlled by these people who had come from poor immigrant backgrounds, yet they couldn't display that publicly. And that's what's unique about this story. That's what's important about this story is what they were making this stand. They were making the stand about segregation in racial attitudes at a time when nobody wanted to talk about it, at least not, in mainstream white America. When I did all my research for my book and stuff like that, that was one of the most striking things I came across is that there was two definitely different Americas at that time. And it even came down to the media being different. There was the white media and the black media. And the newspapers reported things differently. In white media, you never saw things about articles about lynchings, for instance, whereas in black media, it was front page news, every single day. And, that's what makes this so unique. This was basically white America. This story was being told to. And Fieldstein and Gaines realized that at the time. And again, you know, to me, that's why what makes this story so historically important, you know, then and now and going forward, is the daring it took for them to do this story. And like I say, you know, if you put it in the context of the times, it's almost unbelievable, you know, what they did, but they did it, you know, and they deserve all the credit in the world.
Yes, I think for me, it's one of those things where it's hard to imagine 1953 for myself because I wasn't born until 67. And so I have to kind of like look at things about when it comes to history to even just get an idea. You can read history books, you can do all of that, but it's nothing like actually experiencing it, so to speak. And so from my lens, I see it as an interesting thing because this was considered science fiction at the time, right? But Star Trek, which would feature Nichelle Nichols, did not appear until 1966. So after the initial printing in science fiction, what's the name of the book? Incredible Science Fiction, which was published in 1956. It was literally another decade before that would be seen on quote unquote or something like it on screen. So that kind of tells you that even that seed that had been planted, it took literally a decade for it to kind of like take root and be a part of the discussion on race. Because again, to your point, Mr. Quattro, you know, you brought up Dr. King and Rosa Parks in particular. All of this, the things that were going on in the society had kind of like taken place, and it's weird because, and it's for me, it's kind of bizarre because these are people that literally got up every day, went to work, and lived their lives, whatever. But you know, prejudice and racism was a part of the fabric of America. So they sought entertainment and different things, whether it was comic books or radio, particularly at that particular time. Television hadn't really taken off like it did in the 60s, but we know that the physical image of itself, you know, speaks volumes, which is why it's an enduring image, that last panel. We're gonna talk about the last panel later on, but for me, the story it's almost like, I won't say it was predictive, but you can get early on where they were headed. Right. But it was fashioned as a science fiction story, but you kind of like know where it was headed. It's kind of like what we do today with particularly the X-Men comics. We see certain things that kind of reoccurring things that happen when it comes to mutants and the anti-mutant sentiment. So this is one of the stories, because there are others. That's the funny thing about it. This one here sticks out because of the last panel. But this story here is just that image at the end of it is very, very telling. But again, it's fascinating for me as someone, like I said, who grew up in the 60s, in the late 60s, early 70s, and to see that this was even a thing. Because some people, they enjoyed it, but others were like, they were shocked, but they felt like it shouldn't even been in the book, which was weird to me. It's like, it gave you a real honest to goodness feeling, but you didn't really want that feeling. You know, that's to me more telling than anything, you know what I'm saying? Because we all know the history of comics in the South, and particularly, all you have to do is look at All Negro Comics in 1947, the lack of them being able to print issue number 2, Lobo, when it came out, how it was not received well, you know. But yeah, this is an amazing story. I want to highlight our first super chat for the night. Afro Nerd, thank you, says the judge's transcript is worth the price of admission. We can't have them thinking that they can actually become astronauts. I'm obsessed with this comic and the history behind it. Thank you, Afro Nerd Radio. We appreciate that. So yes, sir. So with that said, guys, let's go ahead and get into the story behind the story. Now, Mr. Ken, you have some interesting thoughts as to what happened with this whole thing. So we'll just go ahead and just lay that out.
Okay. Okay. This gets a little complicated, so I'll try to simplify it. The story has always been the story that was always told by Al Fieldstein and Bill Gaines in the 1960s and later was that when they tried to reprint Judgment Day in Incredible Science Fiction number 33, they were told by the Comics Code Authority, which had just come into existence a year before, that they had to remove the black man in the last panel and make him white. And a story, according to the way that they told the story, they refused to do it. And there's a very colorful story behind this, where supposedly Bill Gaines cussed out the head of the Comics Code Authority, this Judge Charles Murphy. And he says, I would rather close down my company than, bend to your will or whatever. And he went ahead and published the story as is. And then he stopped publishing comic books and just started publishing Mad magazine. Well, being a skeptical type of person that I am, it always seemed kind of strange to me that some parts of the story just didn't seem right. One, that, Bill Gaines would be so reckless as to put his entire company, he would rather close down his company than bend to the will of this one, panel and stuff like that. So anyways, I started doing a lot of research into it. And like I said, I knew Al Fieldstein and we discussed it a little bit. And he gave me the same story he'd always told everybody else, that they were forced, or they were trying to be forced to change the color of, was it Tarleton?
Yes.
Tarleton skin in the last panel. Well, I started looking at it, and I started looking at the circumstances around the story itself. And the Comics Code Authority had its own set of rules that, which is what they used to censor comic books at the time. And Derek, if you have that, can you put that up? The Comics Code Authority. This is their set of rules, the editorial guidelines that they would judge comic books on. And they would censor them based upon this. And these were the things that were prohibited to be in comic books and would require changes. Well, there's nothing in the Comics Code Authority that says black people or people of darker skin have to be depicted as white. And as a matter of fact, the only mention of race in the entire set of rules is way down there where it says religion. And if you read it, it says, ridicule or attack on any religious or racial group is never permissible. So in other words, you could not discriminate against a person of color in a comic book, or else you would get in trouble, for doing so. So that was one thing that stood out. But if you look back up at some of the other things that are prohibited, anything that it was basically uncomfortable, anything that would make people uncomfortable, like in a salacious or suggestive illustration, or anything that was basically undesirable, could not be depicted. So my thinking is that Judge Murphy told Fieldstein, remove the sweat droplets from Tarleton's face before you print his story. And even though Fieldstein admitted that was one of the things that he was told by Murphy, he also tried claiming that he wanted him to change the color of his skin, which again, it doesn't match up with the rules of the code itself.
Right.
So then I looked at Charles Murphy. I did research into the man himself, and Charles Murphy had a whole rich social justice background. The reason why he was picked to head up the Comics Code Authority, that's him right there, was because he'd worked with disadvantaged youth, mostly black youth, throughout his entire career. He had a radio show where he would talk about it, and he was a very liberal, open-minded person. So why would this man make an issue of the color of Tarleton's skin? And to me, logically, he didn't. So to rewind here a little bit, I just think that the story that was told by Fieldstein and Gaines in later years was tweaked to make them look better, to put them in a more positive light. And you would have to read some other articles I've written, but I caught Fieldstein in several other pretty big lies. There was a famous lawsuit they were involved in where they sued over the ownership of the 3D process in 3D comics. And they lied throughout that entire case. And I actually have the transcripts of the case. And they surreptitiously recorded Joe Kubert, and they perjured themselves and everything else. It was pretty bad what they did. So they had a history of twisting the truth. But they became, in later years, by the 1960s and 70s, they became like icons of the comic book industry. And the one thing about comic book fans is they love their comic book creators. They love Jack Kirby, they love Steve Ditko, they love whoever. And they create a mythology around these people and have a tendency not to look at them as human beings, but almost as untouchable, demigods or something like that. And they weren't. I've known enough of these old-time artists, and I interviewed many of them over the years, going back 50 years. They're just regular, average people, and they had, the same foibles as anybody else. And basically, the bottom line, the whole story is that the whole story where they supposedly were told to change the color of Tarleton's skin in that last panel is probably totally made up. And, it doesn't jive with the facts. There's nothing that would support it. And I say it sounds good, and I know it's been retold many, many times, but it's probably not true.
Gotcha. Okay. So there's a possibility that this story was sensationalized to sell books?
Well, just to make themselves look better. A lot of these guys, again, it's just like, the way I explain it to people, it's like, telling your kids that you hit 3 home runs in a baseball game when you're 16 years old. Well, who's going to go back and check and see if you actually hit 3 home runs, or if maybe it's just 3 singles that you actually hit? You see what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
And I found numerous cases of that with different people, comic book artists. Sometimes it comes down to the creation of characters. One guy would claim he created it, another guy would claim otherwise, or it could be, or like for instance, a well-known thing is about a lot of people claim that Matt Baker was gay, okay, but his family swore that he was not gay, yet 1 or 2 of the other artists who worked with him, got the impression that he was gay. So the story that's been told, this apocryphal story is, well, Matt Baker was gay. But there's no evidence of it. He didn't have boyfriends, he had numerous girlfriends. And he was, there's numerous pictures of them together, and he was, even the other artists would say that he always had women around him all the time. But it's become an apocryphal story that's told over and over again. And that's one of the problems I've always had with comics history, is that comics history has often been written by comic book fans who don't have a realistic view of things. They have a fan's view of things, and that's totally different. And that's where I've always, for 50 years, I've been sort of like swimming, upstream against is, basing everything I write upon primary sources and factual material.
Yeah. So your research and the background that the background analysis you've done informs you is very different from the story that is,
right,
floating around, and definitely within our community, right, in Black comic boards. Yeah.
Well, a lot of the story, it comes from, there was a book written by a writer named Digby Deal, and the book was about, I don't know, I can't remember the exact title, but it has something to do with EC horror comics. And he goes into great detail about this story that was told to him by Al Fieldstein and Bill Gaines. And they basically lay out the entire story right there. Well, that particular book is cited over and over and over again as the source of this story. So, like I say, you're getting the version told to a guy who was writing, a fan who wrote a book about EC comics, who was writing as a fan, talking to Bill Gaines and Al Feldstein, telling their version of the story. But if you look at the facts surrounding it, it just doesn't jive. It doesn't make sense, because there was no other comic books at the time I've ever found where an artist was forced to change the color of a person's skin. And, Rich, you can probably speak to this. You remember the PSA, the public service announcements they used to run like in DC Comics?
Yes.
Talking about brotherhood and stuff like that. They would always depict, Black kids or Asian kids or Hispanic kids and stuff like that. There was no problem, with depicting people of color. The problem came from sales of comics. I mean, logically, they made the decision, well, it would hurt our sales to put Black people on the cover of comic books, going back to Crown Comics #3 in Voodoo, where Voodoo was a Black character, heroic character inside the comic. On the cover, they had it depict him as white because the comic book wouldn't sell. But that was the choice of the publisher, nothing to do with censorship. And, like I say, that you have to learn how to understand what was going on. The comic book industry, when it's all said and done, is a money-making operation. Right. And they would do whatever they had to do to sell comic books. And, at that time, they decided that not depicting Blacks was one of the things. And it was an economic decision, no matter how they felt personally. Right. To me, it was more important about who they employed. Like, my book was about the Black comic book artists who worked in the 1940s. But after World War II, all those Black artists, except for one or two, lost their jobs when the white artists came back. And they got their jobs back, and the Blacks were all let go. That was a decision by the publishers. Again, that's something that happened outside of the public view, but that was a decision of these liberal Black publishers to not hire Blacks. The only one, and I mentioned this to Derek before we came on the air, the only editor who consistently hired Black artists in the 1950s was Stan Lee. Stan Lee hired virtually every single Black artist who worked in comic books during the 1950s. Yet, you know how many Black artists worked for EC Comics? Zero. You know how many worked for DC Comics? Zero. But Stan Lee hired, I think it's something like 10 of them, virtually every single Black artist, and that includes Matt Baker, Cal Massey, Al Hollingsworth, Tom Feelings, all of them worked for Stan Lee at one time or another. Yet none of them worked at EC. And I confronted Al Fieldstein with that fact when we were talking one time. He got real embarrassed. And he told me, he goes, Ken, he says, that's one of the most most regrettable things I've ever done in my life is to admit I never hired a black artist or a black person for my staff. And yet at the same time, Matt Baker was doing all this incredible artwork over at St. John Comics, which I'm sure you guys have seen, you know, the covers and everything he was doing over at St. John. Yet he wasn't hired by EC, which is right down the street.
And you just to point out, I mean, you also mentioned before the show that you knew Al Fieldstein pretty well. So
yeah, like I said, we became pretty good friends. Like I'd be driving down the street and all of a sudden my phone would ring and he'd go, "Hey Ken, this is Al." And I go like, "What?" You know, it's Al Fieldstein would just call me up out of nowhere, just start to, you know, he wanted to talk. Really, really nice man, a wonderful man. You know, but again, he wasn't perfect.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. You bring that up because the you know, we have this thing in our community where we talk about the timeline and what goes on in the timeline or whatever. And, you know, some of the stuff that's a part of the timeline is not flattering or whatever, but we have to acknowledge the timeline for what it is. You know, the times are what they are. And so when you think about it or whatever, it makes sense that they would try to paint themselves in a higher light because history may not be so kind in that regard. But you know, it's one of those things where it's just kind of like the recording industry. You know, some of the shady businesses that went on in that. And I like Robert Townsend's movie, The Five Heartbeats, because in the industry at the time, they were like, okay, we really can't sell black faces on album covers, so it was no stretch of an imagination to put on, you know, white people on a cover of a black artist album.
Right.
And it was specifically done to drive sales. And one thing I know, the only thing that's more powerful than racism is money. So,
exactly.
You know, and people, you know, they could get along with you if there's some money involved. If there's a way to make some money, you know, we'll do all kind of things to justify or to, you know, move the bottom line. And I mean, that's just what it is. And I just think that when we talk about a story like this or whatever, it's very ironic that they would be a part of history in this regard, but yet in practice, it's a contradiction at work. And so, you know, it is what it is. It's like I like to say about the timeline. Well, you can be upset about it, you can be mad about it, but it is what it is. You know, I'm just glad that we have the truth of the history. So it helps us to understand that you know, our, you know, we have this thing too, Ken, where, you know, or you know about this. Never meet your heroes because they may disappoint you. They may disappoint you.
That is so true, Rich.
Yeah. Somebody who hasn't disappointed us, Peter Parks, thank you for your super chat. So he says, "Thank you guys. I'm learning a lot on this one. Great history being shared."
Right.
Now, Paul does have a question. Shout out to Paul. He says, "Ken, are you familiar with the similarity between Weird Fantasy 18 and Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode Far Beyond the Stars?" Episode 14.
Yeah, I'm going to say I know that Star Trek touched on a lot of the same subject. Star Trek has almost a direct link back to EC Comics, even as far as like some of the writers and stuff like that. Like Harlan Ellison was a huge fan of EC Comics. EC comic books influenced so many later writers and movie makers, like Steven Spielberg, again, was a big fan of EC Comics and stuff like that. And it's, again, you know, that is a credit to Al Fieldstein mainly, because he was brilliant. He was a very, very creative writer. You know, he was kind of wordy in some of those comics. If you read an EC comic book, he would jam full, you know, the balloons with words and stuff like that. But he was very impactful as far as, his influence on later creators and stuff like that. But it doesn't surprise me at all that a Star Trek story would be similar. There's many stories later on in later years, like you mentioned. It took a decade or so before a lot of this is being, I guess, discussed or even shown in mainstream, white television and movies and stuff like that. Like it was not until like it was 1967 they had Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, or some of those other movies that came out at the time. Sidney Poitier and stuff like that. And it took a long time for white America to become comfortable with even discussing racism. It's like, logically they knew it existed, but it was somebody else doing it. Do you see what I'm saying? It was not them. It was somebody else's problem. It was somebody else. It was some guy in Birmingham, Alabama, who was, doing it. It wasn't somebody up here in Detroit where I lived. Yet, it was up here in Detroit, obviously. I mean, there's a famous case which isn't known too well nationally, but it's fairly well known here locally, that in like 1946 or 47, there's an amusement park here, or used to be an amusement park called Bablo. It was a little island. And to get to this amusement park, you had to take a boat to get to it. Well, this one time, this black woman went to get on the Bablo boat, and they stopped her and seated a white woman in front of her, specifically because the woman was white. Now, this is Detroit, a northern city, supposed to be very open-minded and liberal. But they passed over her for this white woman. Well, she ended up suing, and it went to the Supreme Court. And, it became a big case regarding, desegregation and stuff like that. But the mindset has always been, or at least in latter years, I believe, is that racism was a problem somewhere else and not here. And that's what people understand, that racism has almost like different levels to it. There's the blatant George Wallace, Strom Thurmond,
Right.
Bill Connor type racism that we used to see back in the 1960s. But there's also the subtle racism. And that was the things where, black guys not getting jobs, and like Mr. Samuel Joyner, which I'm sure you guys know about. Mr. Joyner was a black cartoonist from Philadelphia. And he was the impetus behind a lot of my research. And he spoke to me about how difficult a job, or what a difficult time he had getting jobs back in the 1950s, just because he was black. Walking in, and it'd be a white guy there, and he would walk in. They'd call the white guy in and look at his portfolio and just send Joyner home. And again, that was in Philadelphia, a very liberal northern city. But that's why this story, and I'll get all the way back to this story here, why it's so important, because this sort of like is in the face of everybody who thought that racism was somebody else and somebody else's problem. Even like that earlier panel that Derek pointed out, where the guy says, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm only one man. And that was the mindset of, I think, a lot of white people, even well-intentioned white people, was that racism was somebody else's problem, and what can I do about it? And again, that's why I think this is such an important story. And you have to really, again, almost pull this story apart and contrast it to what was going on in the country at the time, to really get the full power of how important it is.
No doubt. So
Now, going back to Paul's question, he actually did share a picture from this episode of Star Trek
Oh, okay.
9. So, if I remember, so Paul, I watched this after you told me about it, but it was a while back and it was late night. I think the story is that there's a comic books, there's a comic book studio, And this black man, well, first of all, he's was it? I never watched Deep Space Nine. What's the guy's name?
Avery
Rich.
Brooks. Avery Brooks. Captain
Okay.
Cisco. That's who.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
who he is on the show.
So Captain Cisco has his dream that he's back in probably like the 40s or so, and he's a writer of comic books, but because he's black, they're not going to publish what he's written, if I remember correctly. So it kind of mirrors a little bit of this story, if I remember correctly. But Paul could probably describe it better because I'm probably completely butchering the story.
That's good. I mean, it's one of the more popular of the Deep Space Nine stories or whatever. I mean, Deep Space Nine for its, or should I say, Star Trek in general, were, they were cutting edge science fiction. This was the thing before Star Wars, kind of ate their lunch when it came out in 1977. But for the most part, the whole franchise of Star Trek has, we saw the first interracial kiss through Nichelle Nichols and God,
Shatner.
Shatner.
William Shatner. So that was the first time that took place on screen. And so later on, when they did the Deep Space Nine story, that particular story stood out because in Deep Space Nine, they didn't really deal a lot. Matter of fact, they really did 0 to none racial quote unquote elements on this level. That's why it kind of stood out or whatever for what it was. But they've always done things that have been just considered radical. I don't think that they, at the time when that Deep Space Nine debuted, we got to see a African American captain of a space, of a spaceship. So that in itself was mind blowing for the times, and then we're talking, the early '90s. So what I'm saying. So things are weird like that for people of, Black people in particular, when we talk about science fiction, because there's a lot of newness to it. So here's the thing. Let's talk about the image. That last panel, transition to that, because this panel, for all it is, it's a simple image, right? And yet so much of it speaks volumes. And they say a picture's 1,000 words. So you see this is a black man who, his features are very, very telling. And he's looking out at the stars. And so it's like, I can see why some people wouldn't want that to be put out, because the thought is, well, if he can do it, or if I can see it, I can be it. It's very inspirational and aspirational in that regard.
Right.
And, again, it literally was 10 years later before something like that was even actualized on screen.
Right.
So the image in of itself or whatever, because, correct me, Derek, what was the timeline? I know it was 1953, but what was the timeline of this story? Do you happen to know? Was it like the 24th century, or was that even given?
I don't think it was given.
I don't think they.
Okay. So I think for the readers, they're probably assuming that this is,
way in the future.
I don't know. Well, I don't know if they're assuming it's way in the future or not, but I think it's intentionally nebulous.
When did space travel officially take place in America? Or
Well, it was 1961 that Alan Shepard went up. It was in April 1961.
Yeah.
And the whole space race started in the late 1950s with
Right.
The United States and Russia, going back and forth. But science fiction was very much on the mind of a lot of people at this time, and a lot of that was due to the UFO phenomenon that started after World War II. People became interested in outer space, and there was just a lot of technological advances in the 1950s, and space was a part of it. But science fiction became a very important part of American pop culture at the time. And EC, again, had a lot to do with that. Like I said, a lot of the writers who ended up working for EC, for instance, one of the writers was the guy who wrote Psycho. It was Robert Bloch. He was a writer for EC at the time. And there was various, different ones who went on, careers in movies and stuff like that. So there's a direct connection from EC to the Twilight Zone to Star Trek and a lot of things that came along afterward. And again, that's why EC is such a revered comic book company, because they hired the best. Like I said, they hired the best artists they could and the best writers.
Okay, great. So when we look at that, it's weird to me. If you look at these two panels, and I just see something, guys, and when I see something, it kind of, Derek, I have this thing where is Rich on something or is he on to something?
Mm-hmm.
So I might be on something, but I want you to look at the panel before, right? There's the rocket is shooting up into space, right? And the space fire, whatever, is orange. Okay? If you look at the other panel, you see the astronaut, he's looking out there, you see the blue outline, I guess what you say, or the glass, or whatever, like that's the future. If you really think about it, if you're conspiracy theory like me, that might be something to this. I'm just saying. So he's facing the skies or whatever. But I just, and again, the story is laid out about the blue robots being the second class citizens or whatever. But that's kind of saying that they're the future. He's leaving behind the past. So that's just something, and look, you don't steal my idea, okay? Everybody that's out there.
It took me a while. It took me a while to get what you were saying, but okay, I see it. That's probably intentional.
So,
for anybody who joined late,
I'm just looking at it or whatever. Because that's the thing about art. You can see something one time and you can see it another time and get something completely out of it. I'm be honest, this is the first time I just kind of looked at them side by side like that and got that. So again, that's just one of the little small things I think that art is so good at, is being able to speak to you without really, speaking to you, if that makes any sense, subliminally, that kind of thing. And so that image of the guy, what I'm saying, we talk about Afrofuturism in our space. We talk about science fiction, and whether we talk about writers like Indy Nicole Okafor or the sister that wrote Kindred and the Parable. My brain is going fried. It's been a long day. Octavia Butler. There's aspirations for science fiction has always been there. Matter of fact, there's stories like going back to I know W.D. Du Bois did a story in 1920 that was a science fiction story or whatever. But that's always kind of been there in our history, but it just has not been propped up or talked about, whatever. And so when we look at this image or whatever, I'm saying, that's telling, because some people think that we're not supposed to be a part of the future or dream about the future or aspire to do those things, because we see it throughout history, whether it was through redlining, and you talked about it a little bit earlier, Ken, about the subtle racism that exists in our society, that it's more visceral, I would say, than the actual blatant, racism, because, if I can kill your hopes, if I can kill your dreams, then you'll settle for that second class status. You'll settle for that job at the plant. You won't go after what's possible. When the movie came out a couple years ago, Hidden Figures, about Katherine Johnson and those engineers that work for NASA, that literally was a story that a lot of people, not just black, white, Asian, whomever, did not know that
Right.
that there were women who were actually doing the mathematics to help, the work that NASA did. These things are a lot of times are hidden from us. And so when we look at this panel, I just kind of see all of it. And that's the weird thing about history, and that it causes you to be reflective, but it also leaves you, it's bittersweet, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I mean, and this is slightly off the subject, but you got me thinking about Afrofuturism and, early examples of it. And I don't know if you have a picture of it, Derek, but the Rocket Kelly #3 cover by E.C. Stoner, where it shows a rocket taking off from Africa. I mean,
I can find it, but it'll take me a little bit.
It's that was in the mid 1940s, around 1946, and what it does is that cover depicts the Earth in a rocket ship taking off.
Mm-hmm.
But whereas most of the time when you see depictions of the Earth, they have the United States as the center point.
That was in your book, wasn't it, Ken?
No, but I mentioned to you guys later on.
Okay.
And if you notice, Elmer Stoner put Africa as the center point, and that's where the rocket ship is taking off from. So, that's his subtle way, almost like a subversive way of, asserting, himself. I always thought it was so unique, and so clever, at the time for what he did. Mm-hmm. Because, it's so obvious. It's so blatant.
Yeah.
Every time I see that rocket, I think of the Soul Train for some reason.
Yeah, the Soul Train going around the planet.
Oh, that's funny. I like it. Anyways, I just think that's great. I think it'd be a great shirt. But anyways.
So one thing I want to do, so going back to Deep Space Nine, because Paul, he
got some commentary.
yeah. So let me share one other thing about Deep Space Nine here. Okay, so he corrected me. Thank you, Paul. So Cisco had a dream that he wrote about he worked for a pulp magazine company, and he wrote about a commander of a space station who was black, but his company refused to publish it. And it literally mirrored what happened in Weird Fantasy number 18.
The story behind the story.
Yep.
Right.
So there you have it. Okay. So one other thing, Ken, that you mentioned here, and I think you were trying to allude to it earlier. I just pulled this up. You also provided this, which has a more detailed description on types of depictions that were.
Right. I mean, this is from 1956, where it was like an investigation. There was a lot of investigations into comic books at the time, because comic books were suffering a lot of ill repute at the time, because they were being blamed for juvenile delinquency and everything else. And that's what caused the advent of the Comics Code Authority in 1954. And what this investigator did was went and looked at the effect of the Comics Code had on comic books since it had come out. And this is slightly more than a year after the Comics Code had come into existence. And I think it's really interesting if you read the final line on this page here, and I'll read it out loud. It says, the type of pictorial display is, okay, this type, let's see, the pattern which seemed to establish in these productions, and they're talking about before the Comics Code Authority, the pattern which seemed to be established in these productions also was to decry peoples of non-Caucasian race, such as the Negro or Yellow, by casting the physiognomy in its most horrendous light. Yep. This type of pictorial display has disappeared from code-approved productions. People and animals are shown in their normal forms and structures. So in other words, the Comics Code Authority had a positive effect upon racial depictions in comic books. And again, that sort of like argues against the Fieldstein Gaines story, which says they were being forced to change the color of his skin. I mean, comic books were going out of their way to be, give a positive depiction of people, and they were being forced to, if nothing else. So, it's sort of a bad rap that the Comics Code Authority was being given in that instance. Like I said, there's certain things about the Comics Code I do not like, and I don't approve of any kind of censorship. But their intentions were to put a more positive light on the races. And Derek, I hate to bug you one more time, but can you pull up those?
Yeah. Okay. Sure, give me just a minute.
Religious comics of the same time period. Just let me show you some of the religious comic books that were being published exactly at the same time that Weird Fantasy number 18 came out. Now, these are religious comic books, okay? And this one in particular was called Topics. It was published by the Catechetical Guild, and which published comics for most of the 1940s and actually through the 1960s, I believe. But one of their long-running titles was Topics. And if you can blow that up, that cover on the left came out exactly the same month as Weird Fantasy number 18. Okay, so the idea that comic books would not depict black people because of the Comics Code and stuff is totally disproven right there. And you can look at other examples that's also from Catechetical Guild. Numerous times they depicted people of color in their comics, on the covers and in their stories. It was only newsstand comics that refrained from showing black people, which is an interesting, overlooked, sidelight of comics history. Religious comic books always made an effort to be, positive in their depictions of the races, and I just think that's something which should be recognized. I've done a lot of research, in the right, and you're right. Frederick Wordham was very big. He ran a free clinic for black children in Harlem, but he hated comic books. And one of the things he blamed comic books for was being racist. And if you read Seduction of the Innocent, he talks about that. He talks about Superman being a substitute basically for the Nietzschean Superman and the Aryan superiority. That those 2 pages are from a religious comic published back in 1947. It's called Is This Tomorrow? And it's kind of got a notorious history because it's remembered as being it was an anti-communist comic book. But one of the things is that they attack in this comic book was how they believed that communists were trying to turn blacks and whites against each other. And that's what these 2 pages are about. And it's fascinating to read this. I mean, they literally show lynchings, and communists, in their opinion, were trying to stir up the races to fight against each other. And this is in 1948, that this is being published. Here's just to show that, again, this is one of the Topics comics. But religious comics were way ahead of everybody else as far as their racial depictions. And it's somebody, again, it's one of the things that's been on my list of books that I want to do, but I have a huge collection of religious comics that I wanted to write about. But
yeah,
it's a fascinating sidelight, because religious comics had huge distribution. I mean, that Is This Tomorrow literally had 5 million copies printed. You know, and most of these comics have disappeared because kids just didn't keep the religious comics. You know, they kept Superman. You know, but it's, you know, these comics were actually printed.
Yeah,
I have these.
the race is on for this comic on the left.
Well, I happen to have a copy. I might be putting up for sale pretty soon.
You should have kept that. That should have been kept that for me and my mom.
See the comics going to put up for sale here in the next couple of months. That Crown #3 is going to go up for sale.
Okay, that's an exclusive. All right.
What else we got, Derek? Other than that, I was gonna say, man, we could wrap this up if you're ready. You know.
Yeah. You know, I don't think we have anything else. Really. I did have just a side question. For Mr. Quattro. So we talked about the economic impact, negative impact of having a black character on a comic. You know, especially back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Have you heard anything about Fantastic 452 in the original cover?
About being there's always been a story that the reason why he was had to have a full mask is because Marvel was afraid of putting you know, like a half mask on him, you know, on the cover. But if you remember, if you know your comics history at all, there already had been black characters in Marvel Comics prior to that. There's what was the name of the one who was in Sergeant Fury? Gosh, I can't think of the name of him. The one played Gabe, who played the horn, played the trumpet. That's like 19.
Jones.
Yeah, Gabe Jones. He was already appearing in Marvel Comics, and I'm sure, you know, I don't have any of Sergeant Fury's in front of me, but I'm sure there must have been some issues where he's depicted on the cover. Yeah, Gabe Jones, right? And even DC Comics, even beforehand, had a black character called Jackie Johnson, who was in Sergeant Rock, and that's 1961. So the fear of depicting blacks on covers and on, you know, in comic books had lessened quite a bit by the 1960s. And so I kind of doubt that Marvel was scared off from showing, you know, the Black Panther's face. And just the fact that they, you know, took the chance on the character tells me, because by that time Lobo had come out too, if I'm not mistaken, hadn't he, or right around that time?
The Lobo didn't do that well.
No, I know it didn't, but what I'm saying is that the fear of depicting blacks had lessened quite a bit by the 1960s, because you know, the racial movement, the social justice movement had, you know, evolved quite a bit by the mid 60s, where it wasn't the same sort of thing as it had been, say, like in 1953 when Weird Fantasy came out.
Okay, all right. I just had that curious question. I'd seen a color version of what I think was been described as Kirby's original cover, and he has, you know, the bottom of his face is uncovered, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
I just think it was a stylistic choice more than anything else.
Okay. All right. Okay. So let me just do this. First of all, this has been great. Rich and I have, you know, selfishly been wanting to have this conversation about this this very important book. I was shocked to hear the words that you used, Ken, transcendent, and the most important comic story of all time. That just, you know.
You can quote me on that, Derek.
I just might do that. So this was a real treat to get a chance to talk with you about that, and Rich as well. So one thing I want to do, just share a few things with our with our watchers right now. For those who don't know, we've set up on blackcomiclords.net, our website, a page for Black Indie Comics. What we want to do is to make sure that there's one place that people can go to find out who are some of the Black Indie comic companies. You click on there, you can see all the companies there. I do have a long list of other companies I need to add to this list, and my goal is to get those added this week. But if you are a Black Indie company, a comic company, and you want your comics on this page, just send us your URL, send us your logo and we'll get it up on the page. Send that to blackcomiclords@gmail.com. Also, this is misspelled. I apologize. We had an awesome interview with Brian with a Y, Edward Hill. This is a down level version of a page, but awesome interview last Wednesday night or Thursday night. And if you haven't had a chance to watch that yet, check it out. Also, just a reminder that coming up later this year, Epiphany Engine, which if you don't know about it, is a game-changing crossover. So a lot of Black indie companies are contributing their characters for one big crossover comic. It's going to be, I call it a comic, but it's actually going to be a graphic novel. And we did have a video interview with creators from Epiphany Engine. So keep an eye out for that as well. And this is on the left-hand side, some of the indie companies that are contributing. And then on the right-hand side, two of the characters. And also coming up later this year in August, Atlantic Comic Con in Norfolk, Virginia. So mark the date on your calendar, go in and book that hotel. And I do think the Black Comic Lords will be doing a panel there too. So
Cool.
hey, everybody, make sure you mark your calendars and feel free to show up for this. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe to this video, in addition to subscribing to Black Comic Lords. And click the bell so you'll get notified when we have new videos coming out.
Yes,
And
sir.
also, Real Talk with Rich. So Rich, let's see, for the next few weeks, I guess, can you tell us what people should expect for the next few weeks for Real Talk with Rich?
Well, here's the thing. Real talk with you, but you're gonna probably expect some reruns. Because I will be going on hiatus, vacation / sabbatical for a little while. I initially wanted to do a show next week, but there will not be a show because the things I want to talk about is going to take a lot of effort on my part to do. It's a lot of work, and between school and work is just a lot, guys. So I decided to put that off, and what I'll probably do while I am, regrouping, if I'll say it like that, I'll bring that show to you pretty soon. Mr. Ken Quattro kind of hinted at it. I will be talking about my faith and my connection to comics. And so we will talk about Christianity in comics, some of the history, some of my personal collection, things of that nature. So stay tuned for that. But again, I'm not sure if they're going to have any interviews set up, or you may get some reruns or whatever, but I'll be out for the next couple of weeks or so. But not to fear, I'll be around, trolling in the in the space. So don't act like I ain't here. I'm here, but I just won't be here. I'm here, but it's gonna be here.
All right. So while Rich is trolling in the background, you can always be sure to catch us on the Wednesday wrap-ups. That's our live show, pop-up show. Wednesday nights, we will be continuing those. And then also most Friday nights, then Paul and Mark do Wakanda, Whiskey, and Blurtum. And, you might see some more interviews pop up at some point in time too in the next few weeks or months. So just keep an eye on the channel. And at this point in time, I just want to thank everybody so much for joining and just being part of the Black Comic Lords community. Finally, once again, one more quick plug for Mr. Quattro and his book. So if you don't have this book yet, check out on Amazon, grab it. Invisible Men, the Trailblazing Black Artists of Comic Books by
Yes.
Ken Quattro. Really good book. Highly
Very,
recommend
very
it.
good. Eisner winning books. Let's be clear. They don't hand those out. You know what I'm saying? That's not a participation trophy award.
That's Eisner award right there, right behind me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So with that said, just once again, I want to thank the chat. Thank everybody for joining us. And Mr. Quattro, thank you for a great show. And for Paul,
Shout out to Paul.
Shout out to Paul.
Yeah. Derek is not flexing. You just feel like he's flexing.
Yeah, that's right, Paul.
Yeah. But here's the thing. Before we close out, we kind of talked about getting ready to do the show and how important that book was. And so there are a lot of books in our space that hold a lot of weight, and people will mention weird fantasy in passing, right? But they don't necessarily look at that book as being a very, very significant book. And I said, that's the Grail. I know y'all love Eben, and Eben is great, and Lobo is great, but that's the book. Because what that book, just in a few pages was able to do was chart a trajectory, if you will, of different things that you have. We don't have a lot of the stuff that we have in terms of science fiction without this book. We talk about the timeline and how important the timeline is. Well, that book is on the timeline. And you heard it from our guest tonight about how significant this book is. So, and I encourage you, you may not be able to get the original Weird Fantasy or the reprint, Incredible Science 33. Go get a reprint.
Yeah,
you want this book in your collection, period. You don't want to just know about this book. This is something that you should be able to show your kids or even as a conversation piece with other comic heads to talk about, because that book is very, very significant, y'all.
Yeah, so here are the two books right here once again. Yeah, yep. and the Weird Fantasy reprint is available. There might be one on eBay right now. I know it helped somebody to find one.
I'm sure there are. Yeah, it's been reprinted a number of times. So,
yes. Or you can get it in the hardcover edition or whatever. And again, there's all of the EC comic stuff is pretty phenomenal. If you want, you can get coffee table book versions of this stuff. There's a lot of it out there, guys. You can go to a used bookstore, you can find all of their material. You just got to look for it. It's there for you to go get.
Yep.
And let's see, Phil want Quattro to know that we are closer to getting Matt Maker's street named after him.
Oh, great. That is wonderful. Hopefully you guys know about that, right?
Yes.
They're trying to get the street named after him.
Yeah. Do you know the date? Phil, what's the date? July.
He said the 25th is for us. The exhibit is going to be on the 25th of July. We know that, but as far as the street name and stuff, I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
I was just recently told, I don't even know if I'm supposed to tell anybody this, but what the heck, I got a big mouth. That Elmer C. Stoner has been nominated and will probably become inducted into Will Eisner Hall of Fame. Finally, I mean, Matt Baker's already in it, but I've been pushing for Stoner for a long time, and they finally are going to do it this year. So that's really a huge accomplishment.
They just inducted Billy Graham and Don McGregor this year too. So yeah.
Well, so I tried getting my publisher to sponsor an award named after Stoner and Baker, to call it the Stoner Baker Award, and to be like almost like a scholarship for young aspiring minority artists and stuff like that. But it's again, like with best intentions, and that they go, yeah, okay, and it's basically reward me. So,
a lot of work. That would boil down to is if you're not. I mean, here's the thing. There's lots of work out here, guys. Black Comic Lawyers tries to do certain things. There are other people like my man DJ Phil, who's trying to get a street named after. There's everybody in this space and that's connected to this hobby has an assignment. I cannot stress that enough. There is something for you to do that is life-changing, that's impacting or whatever. And to your point, Mr. Quattro, if enough people attach themselves to that, that could easily happen. But it takes work. It takes work. It takes effort. It takes time. And some of y'all, I'm a preacher, so let me preach. Some of y'all need something to do.
Uh-oh.
Some of y'all need something to do. You know what I'm saying? Get it out the mud, whatever it is there is a lot of work that needs to be done on a historical level, on a social level. This hobby operates and is thriving because of people putting the work in. And
Right.
people like Mr. Quattro, who took the time and effort to create a encyclopedia reference guide in his book for you and I to be able to talk about these artists. This was not a conversation we could have 10 years ago. So I just need you to understand the importance of it. And you can't get mad if you don't know your history because you choose to ignore it or don't even really research it or find it. It's there for you. You know, I learned a long time ago as a preacher, if you build it, they'll come, but you got to build it. So when it comes to our fandom, the history of it, and everything that's attached to it, everybody's got something to do. That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to get off my soapbox. You know, thank you for coming.
Okay. And I have a challenge. If there's any artists watching, this picture right here on the
Yes.
left will be a great homage on some cover.
Oh,
Some comic.
Mr. Cannon White, I'm calling you. Dennis Cowan, I'm calling out you. Marcus Williams, I'm calling out you. Willie Cordy Jr., I'm calling out you. Y'all make Dr. John Jennings, I'm calling out you. let's you know, because again, this is the image that deserves to be championed, to be celebrated, and you know, we can't stress enough the importance of just this book is amazing. The history behind it is amazing, and it's your history whether you accept it or not. So that's all we can say.
All right. So once again, thank you so much. I feel like this was a great show. I really enjoyed it. Mr. Quattro, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The Juice Center stage there. Yeah. And with that said, I think we'll be closing out the show. Black Comic Lords, we're out.
Well, yeah. Peace.